Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Later today, MPs will debate the decision to leave the EU customs union, a key plank of the government's Brexit policy. It won't end in a binding vote, but could give a sense of how much opposition ministers will face in the future. The government says it has already set out two separate alternatives. Here's the leader of the Commons, Andrea Leadsom, speaking yesterday.
I don't expect, as Leader of the Commons, I talk to colleagues right across the House, and I don't expect that anybody would seriously require us to leave the EU but stay in a customs union that would totally tie our hands and effectively lose one of the greatest advantages of leaving the EU. So I just don't believe, MPs are not, they won't require us to do something that's totally against the national interest. So I'm very optimistic that it's not going to come to a decision where somehow the House forces us to stay in the customs union.
Well, that was Andrea Leadsom, Leader of the House. We're joined in the studio by Ali Renison, Head of Europe and Trade Policy at the Institute of Directors. Welcome to the programme. Remind us and the viewers, what is the Customs Union?
So the Customs Union itself is something that only EU member states can belong to. It means that if you belong to it, the EU negotiates all of your trade agreements on behalf, and they set all of the import tariffs on the member states' behalf. And I think that's why actually it's right to say when we leave the EU, we will be leaving the Customs Union, but there is some discussion to be had about whether a new partial, as we've suggested, or if some want a full comprehensive customs union, should take its place.
Right. So do you think that the government's proposals, this idea of the UK collecting tariffs on behalf of the EU, do you think that's workable?
It depends on the timescale. So the Director General of HMRC has said on record publicly several times it would take minimum 5 to 7 years to implement. There have been sort of efforts from HMRC to try and work with parts of the private sector to model these. So I don't think it's totally worth something throwing away, but it does require a very different discussion about what the timescales are needed to make it work. Right.
Well, it wouldn't work, obviously, in the current timetable, would it? Then?
Not under a 2-year time frame. And I think the PM did reflect that in her remarks to the Liaison Committee about different arrangements needing different timescales.
What about the other option that the government has proposed, which is a technological solution, again rejected by the EU?
Well, we don't know if they've wholesale rejected it. We haven't necessarily got into the future framework discussions at that point. There is an issue about whether it totally obviates the need for an actual border on the island of Ireland, and that's the big question, because you can have maximum facilitation, but then it depends on what kind of regulatory arrangements you have first. So to know how much of the heavy lifting technology has to do, you have to know what the future relationship is first.
Right. What's your preferred option, David? You're a Brexit minister.
Well, actually, none of those, really. But I think that probably the one that appeals most is the so-called maximum facilitation model. But Ali's absolutely right. It's not just a question of customs. It's also a question of regulation on both sides of the border. And accepting EU regulation, of course, again, dilutes the extent to which we've left the European Union.
Right. And when you say none of these really are your preferred option, what is your preferred option?
Well, I think that we need a free trade agreement with the European Union. And I think that that's something that we need to discuss with them very quickly. At the moment, of course, the European Union is putting discussion about free trade agreements very much on the back burner until the issue of, for example, the border between Northern and Southern Ireland is resolved. But I do think that a free trade agreement is the preferred option, which of course would preserve the ability of the United Kingdom to strike free trade agreements with third countries outside the EU.
So what we've suggested is something that would not only minimise the cost to manufacturers, but also allow the UK to pursue free trade agreements. The customs union itself, the EU's customs union, does prevent you striking those deals. But if you have a partial customs union, so it's limited in scope to, say, industrial goods, then you have plenty of leverage to actually negotiate on things like agricultural tariffs and many other areas in trade agreements.
Right, and what gives you such confidence that there is that leverage, that it exists?
Because there is a precedent for it, even if it's not desirable in its current form, which is the Turkish customs union, in terms of it provides a precedent to say we can have a partial scope customs union as part of a wider FTA, so a hybrid model, so to speak. And what would need to be negotiated, which the EU is supposedly open to, is giving the UK more of an input into those areas where it cuts the tariffs that are covered by that partial customs union.
Are you reassured that the government, that Theresa May, is going to stick to your party's policy, which is to leave the customs union?
Yes, I am, because she's restated that repeatedly, and several times this week, as a matter of fact. And I think that she recognises that remaining in the customs union is something that is completely off the agenda. Not least, of course, because if we remain in the customs union, we effectively have not left the European Union.
Right. If she were to bend, if she were to be defeated, if the government was defeated on a key motion or an amendment that's coming up in the next month or so on whether to remain in a customs union or not, what would she do?
Well, I don't believe that that's going to happen. I actually believe that the House will vote to leave the customs union. I think that what we're seeing at the moment is the last-ditch attempt on the part of the Remainers to ensure that we don't really leave the European Union, and I'm pretty confident that that will be defeated when the vote does come. Not today's vote, by the way, which is frankly a pretty meaningless vote.
We'll come on to that in just a moment. Do you think Brussels, it is a negotiation after all, will yield on this issue, the partial customs union or whatever it is going to be called, in order to solve the issue of Northern Ireland and that free-flowing trade, and in order for the government to keep to its stated policy?
I think there's a sequencing issue. So at the moment, what they're trying to get through is the backstop as part of the withdrawal agreement, which has, at the moment, Northern Ireland only basically effectively remaining aligned to the entirety of the customs union and most of the single market. So I think that when it comes to the actual future trade agreement, they might consider it, but it would depend, the UK would effectively have to ask for that arrangement first.
Oh. All right, thank you, but stay with us. The motion being debated that David just mentioned actually in the Commons today calls for an establishment of an effective customs union after Brexit. One of the MPs putting their name to it is the Conservative, Sarah Williston, and she joins us now. Sarah, what's the point of it? It's not binding. Tories have been asked and told to abstain, so it's pointless.
No, it's not pointless. It allows people to express their feelings about the debate, because this is not just about free trade agreements. This is about frictionless trade. It's about jobs and investment and supply chains. And just take the work that my committee's been doing around supply chains, looking at the very complex chains that apply to medicines, devices and blood products, for example. We could end up seeing, irrespective of all the deals that go on, very serious problems with the supply chains of medicines.
Right. Is Theresa May wrong about the customs union?
I think that I would agree that we need to have a different kind of customs union, one that applies to goods, as we've just been hearing, and there are precedents for having that. But what we're calling for is something that's effective, and by effective, I mean one that doesn't lead to serious delays at borders and seriously disrupt inward investment and lead to loss of jobs, and that's what this is about. And as I say, disruptions in the supply chain of really important things like medicines.
What do you say to Brexiteers like David Jones who say that this is a last-ditch attempt by Remainers like you to thwart Brexit?
No. We've accepted that Britain has voted to leave. This is about the type of Brexit. I think that a hard, cliff-edge, walk-away Brexit would be immensely damaging, not only to our economy, but have really serious implications for individuals. As I say, you know, I used to find sometimes when I was in practice as a doctor, occasionally there'd be a problem with a batch and there'd be terrible supply chain problems with an individual drug. It happened very occasionally. If there are serious hold-ups in the supply chain, and these are very complex, integrated supply chains, we would see that happening on a massive scale, and that would really hit individuals.
But this is a central plank, though, of the government's Brexit policy, to leave the customs union, to strike free trade deals. It was one of the main reasons Theresa May said that the country would be able to do its own thing when it came to trade. So when the issues of the withdrawal bill and the trade bills come back to the Commons, not today's vote, when they come back to the Commons and there is a motion and an amendment to say that Britain should stay in a customs union or an effective customs union, will you vote against the government?
Well, I think the point is there isn't a parliamentary majority for a hard Brexit. That is simply the case, and that is well recognised. So the point is, can we actually use this as an opportunity to persuade the government to come to a compromise position, which is around having an effective customs union, not the one that we have at the moment, but something that allows frictionless trade. That
will
matters.
You vote against the government, though?
As I say, we need to see where we get to when it comes back. I understand that it's now possibly going to be pushed back to the autumn, and that gives a bit more time for negotiations to proceed. All of us want to come to an arrangement that is the best for all of our constituents, but that allows free trade, frictionless trade. And as others have said, the current arrangements could end up with us swapping the equivalent of a three-course meal for a promise of a packet of crisps later. I mean, we're not going to replace what we already have with all of these trade deals. The prospectus has been oversold, and we're sort of coming up here with Brexit reality. And that's what we're discussing today, because there's been considerable work by a number of select committees that has set out some of the unintended consequences. So that's why we're debating it today.
I'm going to let you go because I think you're going back to the debate. Sarah Wollaston, thank you very much. Listening to that, Ali Renison, what is the solution here? Because we've just heard from Sarah Wollaston, the prospectus for Brexit has been oversold. It will disrupt supply chains for important, critical things like medicines. Are those not good reasons to vote to stay in a customs union?
Well, I think people have to understand that it's not necessarily actually an either-or choice. And I hate to make a sort of a big song and dance about the indefinite article, but a new customs union that is limited in scope allows you to do trade agreements and keep the trade friction to a minimum. So I think it's very important. It's not necessarily either-or that some people are making out.
Do you trust Sarah Wollaston and your other Tory colleagues who have said the prospectus has been oversold about what it can bring to actually vote with the government at those key votes in June?
I think what they ought to remember is that this country voted in 2016 to leave the European Union. Now, being in the European Union comprehends being subject to the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice, being part of the single market, and also being part of the customs union. The country has voted to leave the EU, and therefore we have to leave all those arrangements.
Would it be a betrayal if we don't?
I believe that we ought to make sure that we keep faith with the electorate, and keeping faith with the electorate means leaving the European Union. But I was interested to hear what Ali had to say about the Turkish precedent. Of course, the problem with Turkey is that Turkey is a rule taker. Turkey takes the rules that are established by the European Union. And I don't think that a country such as the UK really wants to be in the position that Turkey is. And trade is hardly frictionless. I think that if you cross the border between the EU and Turkey, you will see long queues of lorries waiting to be processed.
Ali Renison, we've run out of time, but thank you very much for coming in. Held you there.
The pressure is on for Theresa May as MPs debate a key part of her Brexit plans, her decision to leave the customs union. The Prime Minister has already ruled out joining a customs union, but Labour, the Lib Dems and the SNP, plus some Conservative MPs, are in favour of having one. Well, MPs have already started debating over whether it will improve trade for the UK.
Can the Right Honourable Lady explain how it is we have such a smooth-running, fast-growing and very large trade with the rest of the world on WTO terms, where we have to pay EU tariffs and we're not allowed to negotiate them down all the time we're a member of the customs union?
Well, I think the honourable member seemed to be making the point that our trade was growing within the current arrangements with the rest of the world. That seems to be a good thing and suggests that perhaps, therefore, we can carry on increasing our international trade and our global trade even within customs union arrangements.
Well, that debate's still going on in the Commons and is set to last for roughly another 2 hours. But to discuss a little bit more about it, I'm joined by Stephen Purvis, Chairman of Policy North, which thinks the UK should leave the customs union, and James McCrory, Executive Director of Open Britain, which thinks the UK should stay in one. Stephen Purvis, to you first of all. Why should the UK leave? What would the benefit be?
I think, firstly and most importantly, the UK public made a decision to leave the EU, and an inherent part of that decision was that we would leave the customs union. So, firstly and most importantly, I believe that's what was voted for, and therefore democracy dictates that that is what should happen. Secondly, I think certainty is required, and optimism is also required to change Britain's view, perhaps to be a little bit more outward and globally focused, and not dragged down to the lowest common denominator of a deal based on requirements of 26 other countries who have different fiscal driving factors.
OK, well, James McCrory from Open Britain, it's what was voted for. It was voted for in Brexit, was it not, to leave the customs union? That was what Brexit was all about, and it's going to give us freedom to trade with who we like, how we like.
The issue of the customs union was not on the ballot paper. I voted the same as everybody else in the referendum, and the question was do you leave the European Union, not do you leave the customs union? People at the same time promised us that we'd have no drop-off in our trade with Europe, that we'd get the exact same benefits that we get inside the EU, and that there'd be no change to the border status in Northern Northern Ireland, if the government can prove that they can deliver all of those things outside of the customs union, then I'm all ears. All they've actually produced so far is, in their own words, some blue sky thinking that's already been dismissed by the EU, that's been savaged by Brextremists like Jacob Rees-Mogg, and has, by the demonstration of today's debate in the House of Parliament, no support across the House, across party lines. So we should stay in the customs union to protect our trade with, by far, our largest trading partner. Half of everything we buy and sell is with the European Union.
Stephen Purvis, you're talking about the fact that we can broaden our remit, trade with who we like much more freely, but the economic analysis of what will happen is that it's not really going to improve GDP, is it?
I think we have to be extremely cautious of believing any figures. I think the Project Fear figures that came out from the Bank of England have now all been disproved, and I'm very reluctant to believe any 15-year forecast. What I do know is that the implications of a or the customs union are a restriction on our ability to trade freely. An example that's local to us in the north of England would be the preclusion of the establishment of a free port in Teesside that our research shows would lead to 1,500 jobs and a £56 million GDP improvement. That's a real, tangible, deliverable project that will be not allowed if we remain under any form of customs union, and that's the form of.
Sorry, but why should we believe your projections for what an imaginary project could possibly generate if we don't want to believe the projections of GDP?
Well, I think the problem with the projections and the partial projections that were released on 15-year GDP growth post-Brexit was that they really didn't take into account any upside in those forecasts. So, we're a business-led think tank. The research is based on real metrics and business plans that are deliverable. So the Teesside Freeport is a real project without estimates, but with real accurate figures. Those jobs are there to be created. But under a customs union, we are precluded from establishing a free trade port.
James McCrory?
Well, it's the same thing time and time again. It's a series of fantasy promises that have not been delivered. We say these projections are, shouldn't ever be listened to, but this is the same government that is carrying out a pretty hard version of Brexit outside of the customs union and the single market. Their own figures are saying that trade deals with America and India and China, which, by the way, will take years and years to negotiate, even if they're successful, and will involve us swallowing some really unpalatable things to get them. They're saying that there'll be a minuscule addition to GDP, whereas leaving the customs union, these are the government's own figures, and the single market, will lead to a pretty hefty beating for our GDP. This is not rooted in reality. It's a promise of the never, never, while putting up barriers with by far our largest trading partner. As I say, the EU is responsible for half of everything we import and export. We often hear about doing trade deals with places like New Zealand. Well, let's talk about New Zealand. It's 0.2% of all our trade. Even if we doubled it, it would be 0.4%. And we're going to do that while erecting barriers to trade with the people we do 50% of our trade with. It just makes no sense. And the government have put no realistic alternative option on the table whatsoever.
Stephen Purvis, are we cutting off our nose to spite our face?
I don't think so, and I think, being pragmatic, it is not in the European Union's interest for that trade going the opposite direction, that trade with the UK, to be prevented. I don't think the automotive manufacturers of Germany would like to see barriers to trade established, even if we leave the customs union, and therefore obtain independence to strike trade deals that are solely in the interest of the UK and new partners.
James McCrory, your reaction?
The government have had the best part of 2 years now to come up with a solution to this. They're very, very good at saying what they don't want. Oh, we don't want to be in the customs union. We don't want to be in a customs union. We don't want to be in the single market. But all they've actually produced in terms of an alternative model is, in their own words, as I say, blue sky thinking. The customs partnership that they've been put forward has been rejected by the other side of the negotiating table. It's been dismissed by supporters of Brexit like Jacob Rees-Mogg, and it finds no friends amongst people like myself who believe that we should maintain a close relationship with the EU. And the idea that we can just keep now, with the clock ticking, throwing out ideas which have got no basis in reality and put at risk our largest trade with our largest trading partner is a complete dereliction of duty to our economy and our country.
Stephen Purvis, how do you propose that we resolve the Northern Ireland issue whilst leaving a customs union?
I think the Northern Ireland border is a phenomenally important issue. I think there is a technology-based solution to that problem. I firmly believe there is a friction-free border in both movement of people and movement of goods and customs that can be achieved. I think that's well within the realms of possibility. I certainly reject the idea that that's in any way fanciful or just talk. I think that with willing parties on both sides of the border, that can absolutely be achieved.
Jane McCrory, do you think it's possible for the Prime Minister to combine, an independent trade policy, frictionless border, and satisfy both Brussels and the Eurosceptics within her own party?
No, it's impossible. You cannot have the exact same benefits of customs union membership outside of the customs union. And this idea that there are going to be magical technological solutions that will just solve the Irish border conundrum when there is no evidence anywhere in the world of it happening is just a fantasy. When the Prime Minister herself was asked to give an example, she used the American-Canadian border, which features heavy border checks, people with guns, and 100 shootings at the border over the last 10 years. That is nobody's idea of a frictionless border. The customs union is emblematic of a wider issue here, which is the Brexit that was promised to people at the time of the referendum, where we can enjoy all the benefits of membership and none of the perceived drawbacks, is simply undeliverable, and it's not going to be delivered. And that's why more and more people are saying, hold on a minute, this is not what I was told when I was voting last time round, and why more and more people are making the case for a people's vote on the actual deal, the real deal that comes back that the government negotiates with Brussels.
Do you think that's true, though? I spend quite a bit of time out and about talking to people around the country, and I've not yet met one person who's got any enthusiasm for another vote on Brexit. Most people say they're fed up to the back teeth of it.
Well, the People's Vote campaign that was launched a couple of weeks ago put on over 350 events up and down the country in areas that voted Remain and areas like Peterborough and Bury St Edmunds that voted heavily to leave. We then had a rally attended by well over 1,000 people in London the very next day. We've had 35,000 people sign up to receive emails from the campaign within 10 days of its launch. So the idea that there's not appetite out there, the idea that this is not being discussed, I just don't follow. I think that people realise that Brexit, whatever you think about it, is a really big deal, and the idea that it should be left to either government ministers or 650 MPs in London to decide whether the deal that the government comes back with is good enough for our country when it will affect all of us in it for generations to come, I don't think people necessarily subscribe to that theory. I think people want to have a say themselves on the final Brexit deal if it matches up to what it was promised and if they think it's right for our country.
OK, we shall see. James McCrory and Stephen Purvis, thank you both very much.
Thank you.